Hello there, my name is Louis Taylor. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm a composer and a producer based in Bristol, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about mixing. I've always found that mixing is a little bit of a dark art, and it's kind of hard to get your head around sometimes, especially when you've got quite a few different tracks and microphone signals and all that kind of stuff going on. So I wanted to kind of delve into a project that I've been working on recently with Amazon Audible, and I recently went up to Manchester to record some music with the Northern Film Orchestra. So I've got some stems, I've organised all the takes, and I'm kind of at the mixing stage now, so I wanted to kind of show you a little bit about the process. So let's jump over to Logic and have a look. So as you can see here, I've got a few different tracks. They're all in one sort of session because this is one episode. They're quite short episodes, about 10 minutes, and this is basically all prepared. This is done. I've already finished all this now. So I just went through, selected all the takes in Pro Tools, bounced them all out, and then put them in here so that I can do all my editing in Logic, because I just find it so much. I'm a lot better at Logic just because I've been using it for longer, really. So the first thing that I think you need to kind of bear in mind is sort out the kind of instrument levels by default. So if you look, and I go right back to the beginning here, this has kind of changed a little bit since, but the way I started things off, and bear in mind that some of this is kind of for the sake of headroom, I've moved the winds all down to around -8 and the bassoon a little bit lower, just because when they were recorded, the microphone signals, I don't know whether it's to do with the instruments themselves or the microphone signals, but they were inconsistent basically. So they were a lot louder than the strings, and I wanted to just bring them down a little bit. So I've brought them down to level about -8 dB, -10 dB. I've put the room microphones, the outriggers and stuff like that around 0, with the exception of the outriggers actually, where I ended up boosting them a bit because I feel like it gives it a really nice bit of space. And then I basically brought the violins, the strings down to -2, left the bass where it was because that's recorded quite quietly. So that's basically the summary of it. It's just good to make sure that there's a kind of consistent level, and as you can see here as well, I've actually added a little bit of extra gain on the strings too, just to put them up a notch, because I feel like they can be a little bit drowned out sometimes by all the room noise and the winds and stuff like that. One thing that I would first of all do is to install a gain plugin onto your stereo out, just so that you can adjust any levels you want, but mainly so that you can select mono on or off. It's a really important part of this process, and it makes a big difference to the overall mix. I think that mixing in mono and mixing a little bit quieter than you would normally listen to can help you get a nicer, more even balance. And I think that, I've heard some people say, like Dan Keane, for example, that if you mix in mono, it's going to sound, if it sounds great in mono, it's going to sound even better in stereo, and so on. It's just a really great tip that I just wasn't doing for very long until recently, and I think that it makes a big difference, so worth doing that. Now I've got the levels sorted out, I go in and do this on a track sort of automation basis, really. Essentially, I've just gone in and adjusted the levels of each instrument at each point in the track. So the reason for this is because, to start with, quite a lot of the instruments aren't always playing, but so that means there's a lot of room noise. Now obviously you don't necessarily need to use automation, you can just cut, like that, and then mute it here, which is fine too, no problem with that. But I find that it's just a little bit more consistent to have everything on one sort of plane, and I do occasionally do that when I know that there's an entire section which just doesn't include that instrument. But when it's kind of one continuous take, I like to have an automation so I can slide it in a little bit easier, find it a little bit smoother. Then what you want to kind of do is go through and say, like for example here, the flute's actually a little bit louder. It needs to be louder because that's playing the melody. So one thing that I've been doing whilst mixing is actually looking through all the scores of everything, which I've got in this. I've just printed them out and put them in this little binder here, and I look through just so that I know exactly what's going on in the music in case my ears don't pick it up so well. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, yeah, the flute's playing there, but there's no oboe, there's no clarinet, so I've muted them here, and there's no bass clarinet. But they come in around bar 24 or something like that, and then you bring them in there. So you don't really need to think about it too much. You just look at the score, follow it along, and adjust the automation accordingly. So that's quite a useful little tip too. So moving on from that, once that's done and you've successfully gotten rid of all of the extra sort of excess room noise that you don't need, it's probably worth looking at the different sort of what's actually going on in the music a little bit more. So for example, in this section here, we've got quite a lot of trills happening at the beginning here, and trills are a little bit tricky because you've got a big dynamic contrast going on. It's quite a long period of time. The instrument levels are inconsistent, and the actual loudness of each instrument is inconsistent too. So in order to blend them properly, you do actually have to think about it. To start with, these levels were all over the place. It sounded really boxy and loud in the mid-range. This is when I started to notice that the room might be a little bit problematic. So what I did is I added a little bit of EQ just to tamper down on this mid-range section here. But also, I find that you get quite a lot of overload in the 2K and the 5K region, so just dipping them by a couple of dB each really helps. Just a little kind of default high pass and low pass going on here, so that there's just a little bit of cap there. No unnecessary frequencies happening, and yeah, that's basically it for that. You just kind of have to go through it all and check the levels basically, and make sure everything's sounding as you want it to. All the lead lines or the melodies sounding good. If you want a little bit more of the pizzicato to come through, for example, you can do that. When you've done the levels, I think that it's a good idea to go through and pan everything. So this is when you might want to start coming out of mono, obviously, because you don't want you obviously don't want any, you can't have panning in mono basically. And also, I'd like to mention too that the room microphones are really handy for a nice amount of natural reverb. Something that people in more amateur recording sessions don't tend to do is have room microphones. So, if you want that big orchestral sound, you're never going to achieve that with just close microphones. It would sound very boxy. You get a lot of spill. It just sounds very sort of, it's not what you would expect. You're never going to have your face right up to an instrument like that unless you're in a practice room or something, which is not how you want to listen to something, is it? You want to be in the audience, right? So the room microphones just glue everything together, basically. So it's worth looking at which points you might want a little bit more room or less, because, for example, in this section here, I think I wanted a little bit less because this is a theme for a toad. And I think it just sounded a little bit better with less room, so I'll just play that for you. So that's basically that. It's not as intimate as you might have been expecting based on what I was saying, but it's a lot more intimate than, say, this, which is a little bit more of a sort of emotional theme. And I've actually boosted the room microphones quite a lot here, and the outriggers, so that we've got a really nice warm sound. More on that in a second. I'll just play you that first. Very nice, very warm, roomy, smooth, silky. That's exactly what I wanted there. So with that in mind, it's time to move on to the panning, as I said. So let's just get all the panning information up so we can see what is going on. None on the bass. I like to mono the bass, by the way. If you didn't know that already, it's always a good idea to just have your bass mono, unless it's actually playing really high stuff, because that's different, but you can automate it. So one thing that I sort of realized as I was doing this, what I normally do is I like to set my high frequencies wide, sort of mid ones less wide, and then bass frequencies as central as I can, with the double bass being really central. But I found that I wasn't really getting the space that I wanted. It didn't sound quite as spatial and wide and clean as I wanted it to in certain places. So I just experimented. And what I started off with was, for example, the violins. I normally just set them to about 25 right and left. You know, violins 2's on the left, violins 1's on the right, 25 on each side. It's pretty good. And then, you know, violas plus 15, cello maybe minus 10. So it's kind of like nice like that, and then bass in the middle. It's a nice, well-rounded sound. But what I found is that, for example, here, this is a really big, thick, it's a very overly saturated texture, really. Not that there's actually a lot going on in the parts, but there's a lot of instruments playing the same stuff, and without the panning, it can feel a little bit overwhelming. So I thought, how can I do something about that? And obviously, you know, it seems obvious now that I've been talking about this, but this is where I started to think about it. I just panned everything really widely, and it actually sounded really, really nice. So what I'll do is, towards the end of the video, I'll play you the before version of this track and the after version, so you can hear the raw takes as it is and all of the processing that's going on there. But before I do that, I just wanted to talk about a few effects that I've been putting on this first, because I think they're important to mention. Going back to that one that I just showed you, what I'd like to look at next is the effects that's going on. So obviously we've got some reverb. Cinematic Rooms, great overall all-round reverb, sounds really nice. Very, very highly recommend it. And as you can see throughout the score at different points, I've kind of added more or less reverb depending on the style of music. Quite a bit more wetness going on in this particular cue due to the sort of legato nature of it. And also the pace, I think that's quite important to consider. If you have loads of reverb on something that's got a lot of momentum and speed, fast rhythmic values, it can become quite noisy and washy and muddy. So it's worth bearing that. And I've also adjusted the reverb time a little bit here too. So that's one thing to bear in mind. But one of my favourite effects that I've been using here, and I'll just come over to this cue so that you can sort of see what's going on here, other than this crazy panning going on, because you'll see in a minute, it's a very sort of textural composition. We've got this ghostly delay, which is, you know, sort of what I've called it, but I've also put it on the winds here, and I think that it's on the oboe previously somewhere else. In that piece, actually, it's in this cue here, the one that I just showed you. It's pretty subtle. It's probably not as subtle as maybe some people would have it, but I just think it sounds really nice. It's definitely a lot less subtle in this section. So this is a wintry sort of music. It's a cold and lonely winter, the cue is called. So I'm just going to show you it. It's got quite a lot of panning going on, and these ghostly effects on these. I've got these string harmonics basically in the violin 1 and 2. There's these string artificial harmonics that are glissanding, if that's a word, up and down the violin, and it sounds almost like there's a little tiny hole in a window, and there's a lot of whistling wind coming through. And we've got this kind of nice texture in the strings, this sort of undulating texture with a wispy melody in the clarinets and flute. And outside of this, I've got some virtual instruments like crotales doing some really kind of icy sounding bowed effects. So, but I'll just play it as it is for now. Very nice, and I quite like the kind of delay effect that it has there, which kind of just fades into the distance nicely. Just to kind of solo these woodwinds here, you can kind of hear it a bit clearer. Just beautiful. the playing. You know, it just having the live instruments. It just, I can't even. I don't know if I can describe how much it elevates the score. You might not notice it that much in the sort of background when you're listening to the audiobook, but after writing it and just hearing it in person, and after I've mixed it and everything now, it's just so wonderful to hear that. And if you ever get the chance to work with live musicians, I just take it. Just seriously take it. It's a really, really incredible experience that I'll never forget. And it's just every single time I work with live musicians, I feel the same way. It's just amazing. So and just to kind of cap that off, I'll just show you these strings that are happening here so that you can get the same kind of effect. See, that's something that's actually particularly difficult to do with virtual instruments too. That glissandi artificial harmonic is a very kind of niche technique that doesn't. It's not really recorded for sample libraries very well, so it's definitely worth using real people for that, and the emotion you get out of these lower instruments too. Yeah, just great, really. But anyway, moving on. Let's have a little listen now that I've explained a lot of the effects that are happening, the panning, the levels, all the things that have gone into mixing this. Let's have a little look at that cue that I was talking about earlier. And here is, I'll show you the before first, and then I'll play the after. So that's everything for today. Thank you very much for watching right to the end if you have. I really appreciate the views and the support. Please do leave a like and a comment, share with your friends, anyone you know that might find this useful. I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe. I'm going to try and kickstart this channel now and get it going, so any help would be greatly appreciated. And I hope you learned something today. Let me know what you think, and see you next time. Thanks very much. Bye.